One of the essential teachings of Christianity is that the Bible is inerrant, having no contradictions. But is that actually true? Because there are a lot of verses that seem to disagree with each other, and a lot of Christians have trouble explaining these verses, and many skeptics of Christianity will teach that the Bible has hundreds and even thousands of contradictions and errors. So in this episode, we're going to examine 6 of the biggest alleged contradictions in the Bible, and I'm going to show you how these contradictions aren't actually contradictions. Hi, my name is David Cipriano. I am a youth pastor, and here on this channel, we're all about learning the Bible and its principles. Here we cover topics like theology, apologetics, and Christian living. And in this episode, we're going to look at the biggest alleged contradictions in the Bible. Now, online, there's many different lists and videos of Bible contradictions, and so here I've put together a list of 6 of the most common ones that are given. Now, as I said before, there's way more than 6 examples of ways that the Bible might seem to contradict itself. Some might even say hundreds or thousands, but I obviously can't explain all of those in just this one video. So if you have a contradiction that I didn't cover here, then leave it in the comment section down below, and in the future I might make a part 2 to this episode. And personally, as a Christian, I don't have a problem with saying that there are many times where the Bible may seem to say one thing in one place, but then another thing in another place. But I think that instead of just ignoring these passages, I think that it's better to examine them and see what the truth is. And so let's cover some of these biggest supposed contradictions in the Bible. Number 1, we have this question, has anybody seen God? Here's what John 1:18 says, "No man hath seen God at any time. The only begotten Son, which is in the bosom of the Father, he hath declared him." So we have this very clear statement, no man hath seen God at any time. But here's what Genesis 32:30 says, "And Jacob called the name of the place Peniel, for I have seen God face to face, and my life is preserved." And so, yeah, this may be a seeming contradiction, because nobody has seen God at any time, but Jacob did. And if you were to look throughout the Old Testament, you'll see that many other people also saw God. For example, there's Abraham, Hagar, Moses, Joshua, Job. And so how could it be that nobody has seen God, but many people actually have? And the immediate answer may seem to be that this is a contradiction in the Bible, but let me explain what's actually being said and meant here. So let's look at this passage, John 1:18. Again, it says, "No man hath seen God at any time." And this aligns with verses like 1 Timothy 6:16, where it's talking about God, and it says, "Who only hath immortality, dwelling in the light which no man can approach unto, whom no man hath seen, nor can see." This also agrees with 1 John 4:12, which says, "No man hath seen God at any time." And these are statements about the spiritual nature of God. Because remember what Jesus taught, God is a spirit. John 4:24, he said, "God is a spirit, and they that worship him must worship him in spirit and in truth." And so God is a spirit, not a physical being like a human. And so as humans, we are limited in perceiving God because physical eyes cannot perceive spiritual beings. And it's kind of like gravity, because you can't see gravity because it's invisible. That doesn't mean that gravity isn't real or that it doesn't have evidence, but it's just not some physical object that you can see. It's just like love or air or radio waves. These things are all real, but you can't visibly see them because they're not physical objects like that. And so you can see the effects of these things, you can see the evidence of them, but you can't visibly see them. And similarly, God is invisible and God is unseen. But Jesus has declared the nature of the unseen God to man, and he's showing us who God is. And that's really what John 1:18 is saying. Because if you were to go to that chapter and look at the context in the verses before, especially in verses 1 and 14, we see that Jesus is being described and introduced. We see that Jesus is the Word. He was with God in the beginning. He is God. Jesus is the Word become flesh. And it leads to verse 18, which says that no man hath seen God at any time. The only begotten Son, which is in the bosom of the Father, he hath declared him. And if we skip ahead in the Gospel of John to chapter 14, we see another passage that really aligns with this one and helps to clarify it. Because Philip said to Jesus, Lord, show us the Father, and it sufficeth us. Jesus saith unto him, Have I been so long time with you, and yet hast thou not known me, Philip? He that hath seen me hath seen the Father, and how sayest thou then, Show us the Father? And so Jesus being the Word, Jesus being God, was a declaration to the world of God. And so these passages, John 14:8-9 and John 1:18, really align with each other, and they help to explain each other. And so it is true that nobody has seen God in his full, infinite, spiritual essence. That's what verses like John 1:18 are saying. But people have encountered physical manifestations of God, and that's what we see in Genesis 32:30. Where again it says that Jacob says, I have seen God face to face, and my life is preserved. But I think that whenever we realize these different passages and we reconcile them, we notice that Jacob did see a physical manifestation of God, but he did not see God in all of his glory or in spirit form. Rather, Jacob witnesses a theophany. A theophany is a physical manifestation of God, and there are many other people in the Bible who also witnessed a theophany, or sometimes it was a Christophany, where it was Jesus Christ specifically. People who saw theophanies were Abraham, Hagar, Moses, Joshua, Job, and some others. And so it's true that nobody has ever seen the complete spiritual essence of God, but there have been a few people who have seen a physical form of him. And maybe this whole idea seems kind of confusing or contradictory. So I'm going to give you an illustration that will hopefully make this make more sense. So think about a person's voice over a phone call. You're talking to them and then you can hear their voice, and you can experience somebody by hearing their voice over the phone, but you aren't completely experiencing them or witnessing them in their full reality. Yes, you can hear them, but you can't touch them, you can't see them, you can't smell them, but you do partially experience them through sound. And likewise, people in the Bible like Jacob, Abraham, Moses, who encountered God, they only saw a limited version of God. It was not God's full, infinite essence. It was a manifestation of God in physical form, but remember that God is a spirit, and thus nobody can see him. And so, in summary of this alleged contradiction, John 1:18 and Genesis 32:30 don't contradict. They're just talking about two different things. They're referring to different levels of seeing God, because John 1:18 is saying that nobody has fully experienced God or witnessed his infinite spiritual essence, and that's true. But Genesis 32:30 is referring to a theophany that Jacob witnesses. It wasn't God in his spiritual form. It was just simply God come down to earth in physical form. And I think that we should also remember here that the New Testament writers were deeply familiar with the Old Testament. And so a person like John really knew what he was talking about whenever he was saying that nobody had seen God at any time. For example, he quotes Isaiah 6 in John 12:40 and 41. He writes, He hath blinded their eyes and hardened their heart, that they should not see with their eyes, nor understand with their heart, and be converted, and I should heal them. These things said Isaiah when he saw his glory, and spake of him. Whenever John records this, this is actually a quote from Isaiah 6, which is the same chapter where it says that Isaiah saw God. He wrote in verse 1, "In the year that King Uzziah died, I saw also the Lord sitting upon a throne, high and lifted up, and his train filled the temple." And so clearly John knows and understands what Isaiah 6 says, and yet he still has no problem with writing what he wrote in John 1:18, where John the Baptist said that nobody has seen God at any time. And so this is not a contradiction or a misunderstanding. This is about different contexts and different meanings. And so John 1:18, 1 Timothy 6:16, and 1 John 4:12 are not contradictions to other passages. All right, now let's look at contradiction number 2 with the question, does the Bible condemn incest or does it condone it? Well, let's look at Leviticus chapter 18, which says, "None of you shall approach to any that is near of kin to him to uncover their nakedness. I am the Lord." And then in verses 7 through 18, it gives this really long list of people who are considered near of kin. There's father, mother, father's wife, sister, father's daughter, mother's daughter, son's daughter, daughter's daughter, father's wife's daughter, father's sister, mother's sister, father's brother's wife, daughter-in-law, brother's wife, woman and her son's daughter, or her daughter's daughter, or a wife and her sister. And a condemnation of intermarriage is also found in verses like Leviticus 20:17 and Deuteronomy 27:22. And so the Bible made it abundantly clear that incest and intermarriage is wrong. And yet, Abraham, the great patriarch of faith, does exactly that. We find him admitting this in Genesis 20:12, where it says, "And yet indeed, she," referring to Sarah his wife, "is my sister. She is the daughter of my father, but not the daughter of my mother, and she became my wife." And so on the surface, intermarriage is wrong, and yet Abraham does it. And here's God's response to it. It's in Genesis 17:15 and 16. It says, "And God said unto Abraham, As for Sarah thy wife, thou shalt not call her name Sarai, but Sarah shall her name be, and I will bless her, and give thee a son also of her. Yea, I will bless her, and she shall be a mother of nations, kings of people shall be of her." And so maybe it seems strange to you that God would be affirming and blessing this marriage whenever we have so many Bible verses that condemn this sort of thing. And there's even other cases in the Bible of people marrying close relatives. But here's how we can really reconcile all of these facts and see them as not contradictory. You see, back in the beginning of the Bible, people marrying relatives was justified. And I want to make it clear that I don't support this today. I'm not in favor of it at all now. But back in the beginning of time, in the beginning of humanity, it was justified. Because remember that Adam and Eve were the original humans, and according to the Bible, they were the ancestors of everyone. God didn't create people independent of them. Rather, God created these two original humans, and then the entire rest of humanity is a descendant of them. And so, as a result, people had no choice in the beginning. And this thing was also true in the days of Noah after the flood, because remember, Noah and his family were the only ones who were spared, and thus those people had to marry family members. But here's another thing that we should remember when reading the Bible, and it's that God actually did not forbid inter-family marriage until Leviticus 18. By the time that this passage comes, there were so many people on earth that marrying a family member wasn't necessary anymore. And so whenever Abraham married his half-sister Sarah, this wasn't disobedience because God hadn't condemned it yet. And think about why incest is bad today, outside of the fact that it's just gross. One of the reasons why it's bad is because recessive traits become dominant. And that doesn't really happen whenever you're marrying a non-family member. But back in the original days of humanity, genetics were more pure. because Adam and Eve were perfectly designed by God, but then over the years, over the thousands and thousands of years since then, genetics have gotten worse and worse, and so there is a danger biologically in intermarriage now that did not exist back in the early days of humanity. And back in the beginning, incest wasn't considered to be weird, it was not illegal, it wasn't a sin, and so it's not a contradiction that Abraham and Sarah were married even though they were half siblings. But also think about this. Even if incest had been wrong at that time, back whenever Abraham and Sarah did it, it still would not be a contradiction. Just because the Bible records something happening doesn't mean that that thing is right. Because there's so many passages in the Bible that are descriptive rather than prescriptive. In other words, just because the Bible records an event happening doesn't mean that it should have happened. I mean, the Bible tells us about a lot of things that weren't right, but they still happened anyway. The Bible tells stories about murder, about assault, about people telling lies, people committing blasphemy. And just the fact that these things are written in the Bible doesn't mean that they're right. It's just simply the Bible exposing the sinful nature and actions of humanity. But even at that, even if Abraham and Sarah's marriage was wrong, it's still not a problem that God promised to bless them. Because God blesses all kinds of people, and all kinds of people are sinners. And so, if you have a problem with God blessing a sinner like Sarah or like Abraham, do you expect God's blessing on your life? Because you're not perfect either. And so it still would not be a contradiction that God promised to bless this marriage. And really, the Bible has no contradictions when it comes to incest or intermarriage. Because there were times when people married family members before incest was outlawed, meaning that they weren't committing a sin. And then there were also times whenever people committed incest after it was declared a sin, but just because the Bible records it happening doesn't mean that it was right or that it was affirmed. And so no, there's no contradiction about incest in the Bible. Now let's look at contradiction number 3, and it's about Jesus' different genealogies in Matthew and Luke. So we find the genealogy of Jesus found in Matthew 1 and in Luke 3. And before we get to the real alleged contradiction, I want to talk about an insignificant difference first, and its spelling differences. For example, Matthew records Boaz while Luke says Boaz. And yes, these are differences, but they aren't contradictions, and they're not typically seen as contradictions by people, but the real alleged contradiction that people actually talk about and care about is the fact that these genealogies are listing different people. And I'll put these genealogies up on the screen so that you can see it yourself. You could also just look at it in your Bible. But here on the screen, I've put up the genealogy from Abraham to Jesus that's found in both Matthew 1 and Luke 3. And you can see it for yourself that they agree from Abraham to David, and both of them call Joseph the father of Jesus. But outside of that, these genealogies are completely different in between. And there's a few explanations or answers to these differences. The first is that one or both genealogies are wrong, and this is a contradiction in the Bible. Now, as you can probably guess, I don't think that this explanation is the right explanation, and even if you don't presume or believe in inerrancy, I still don't think that this is a good explanation of these texts. And I'm going to talk about that argument more later, but I don't think that this is a contradiction. Now, here's one possible explanation of these genealogies, and this explanation was held by the church historian Eusebius. Eusebius was a 3rd and 4th century early church father who was known as the father of church history, and here's what he believed. He said that Matthew was tracing the biological lineage, but then Luke was considering levirate marriages. And if you don't know what a levirate marriage is, it was when a man died without having any sons, and the tradition was for that dead man's brother to marry the widow and have a son who would carry on the dead man's name. And if this is the case, this would make Heli and Jacob brothers, because both of these guys are called the father of Joseph, and the reason why there are different recordings here is because of a levirate marriage. So Heli could have died without a son, so Jacob married Heli's widow, who gave birth to Joseph, meaning that Heli was referred to as the father, even though Jacob was the biological father. And this would make Joseph the son of Heli legally, but then the son of Jacob biologically. And so in this case, Matthew and Luke are both recording the same genealogy, which is through Joseph's biological line, but then Luke is following the legal lineage, which considers the levirate marriages. And so I think that this explanation is plausible, and I wouldn't say that it's definitely wrong, but I actually think that there's another explanation that makes even more sense. And so here's what I believe is the best explanation of these differences, and it's one that most conservative biblical scholars today would agree with. And it's that Matthew is recording Joseph's bloodline through David's son Solomon, but then Luke is tracing Mary's bloodline through David's son Nathan. And so since you have a different lineage on your mom's side and your dad's side, this wouldn't be a contradiction. This is just simply telling two different sides of the story. And so this explanation sounds really good, but then there is a seeming problem. And it's that both genealogies referred to Joseph as the father of Jesus. And a skeptic of this explanation would say that Luke can't be talking about Mary's line because his genealogy lists Joseph as the father. But let's notice Luke 3:23 and what Luke says here. It says, "And Jesus himself began to be about 30 years of age, being, as was supposed, the son of Joseph, which was the son of Heli." And I want you to pay attention to that phrase, "as was supposed." I think that there's an obvious implication that Jesus was not the biological son of Joseph, but just the supposed son. I mean, tracing a genealogy through the mother's side would have been very unusual, especially in that culture. And so it's not strange and it's not contradictory and it's not wrong that the father's, or in this case, the stepfather's name is being listed. And since there was no Koine Greek word or phrase that was specifically used for son-in-law, Joseph was called the son of Heli by marriage to Mary. And I also think that there is something interesting to consider here, and it's that through both Mary's line and through Joseph's line, Jesus is a descendant of David and is therefore eligible to be the Messiah. He would be eligible through Solomon's line, and he would also be eligible through Nathan's line. And also, let's really just think about this whole seeming contradiction critically, because I don't think it really makes much sense for these genealogies to be wrong. And maybe if you're a skeptic, maybe if you already disagree with me, that statement may sound ridiculous and like I'm not thinking critically, but I just want for you to hear me out for a second. Because even if the Gospels were just made up lies and hoaxes, the writers, Matthew and Luke, still wanted to be taken seriously. These men would have realized that starting out with a fake, inaccurate genealogy of Jesus would have immediately destroyed any credibility. Like, imagine if there was somebody who was trying to write a U.S. history book, but they were a conspiracy theorist. Like, let's imagine that Alex Jones is writing an American history book. Well, even if this person wrote in a bunch of conspiracies and a bunch of wacky things, but even if they included within this book a list of the US presidents, that list would probably be right. And the reason why is because they want to be taken seriously. Yes, they might believe a lot of conspiracies. Yes, they might lie about a lot of things, but they would know that if they had a fake US presidents list, then nobody would take them seriously at all. And so I think that we can believe that both genealogies of Jesus are accurate and correct, even without believing in biblical inerrancy or infallibility. And just consider who the writers were, because Matthew was a personal disciple of Jesus. Matthew would have had this knowledge of his lineage accessible to him, and he's writing this primarily to a Jewish audience who would be able to quickly fact check him and call him out. The ancient Jews cared a lot about this type of thing, and so they wouldn't just let this slip. Also think about Luke, because throughout Luke's gospel, he is incredibly detailed. He tends to give a lot more details than the other three gospels, and with these things being considered, it just doesn't make sense that Luke would essentially be writing down random names whenever his habit is to include so much detail. And if Matthew or Luke got their genealogy of Jesus wrong, people of that time frame would have noticed it, and they definitely would have called them out on it. And so, whether Luke was considering levirate marriages, or if it was just Matthew recording Joseph's line while Luke is recording Mary's line, these genealogies aren't a contradiction. All right, here's case number 4, and it's a question: does God tempt people with evil? Because according to the Bible, God cannot be tempted with evil, and he doesn't tempt people to do evil, but God also tempted Abraham to kill his own son. So let's look at James 1:13. It says, "Let no man say when he is tempted, I am tempted of God, for God cannot be tempted with evil, neither tempteth he any man." But then we look at Genesis 22, and it says, "And it came to pass after these things, that God did tempt Abraham, and said unto him, Abraham, and he said, Behold, here I am. And he said, Take now thy son, thine only son Isaac, whom thou lovest, and get thee into the land of Moriah, and offer him there for a burnt offering upon one of the mountains which I will tell thee of." And yes, I can see why many people think that this is a contradiction, but let me explain to you why it's not one. It's because the word tempt is being used under different contexts, and in the original languages, they're not even the same word. Because remember, these passages were written in different languages and thousands of years apart, which isn't to say that the Bible was mistranslated or inaccurate, but rather that we have to understand that the same word can have different meanings in different contexts. And many people will think that this is just twisting, or that this is just sneakily picking and choosing, but really this is just the reality of how languages work. For example, words like set, run, business, these are all words that have many different meanings, and you can understand the meaning by looking at the context. And so whenever the word tempt is being used in James 1, it is a different context than whenever tempt is used in Genesis 22. And in Genesis 22, the Hebrew word that's being translated as tempted is the word nasah, which means to test, try, prove, tempt, assay, put to the proof, or put to the test. And so in Genesis, we see that Abraham's faith is being put to the test, where whatever Abraham does is going to reveal the faith that he has. But then we look at the context of James 1:13, and the context is about being tempted by sin. And the conclusion here is that whenever you're tempted by sin, don't blame it on God. God is not drawing you to evil. And so as we can see, there's a difference between a temptation to sin and just simply being put to the test, which is what nasah in Genesis 22 means. And a person might argue that God was tempting Abraham to do something sinful, like the context of James 1 is saying. And skeptics love to criticize God and the Bible for this story where God tempts Abraham to kill his own son. But I think that people often ignore the fact that God actually told him not to. Because yes, God did say this, and yes, it was a test, but remember that before Abraham would have done it, God clearly stopped him. So if you want to argue that God tells Abraham to kill his son, you'd better include the whole story about how God actually stops him and Abraham doesn't kill his son. And yes, maybe we have a hard time wrapping our minds around this test, and maybe I don't have all the answers for that, but God actually didn't make him do it. God stopped him. And thus, this isn't a contradiction in the Bible. Because God never makes us sin and he never tempts us with sin, even though God does sometimes put our faith to the test to reveal our trust in him, and that's what we see with this story of Abraham and Isaac. All right, contradiction number 5, are we justified by faith or by works? Well, according to Romans 3 and 4, we're justified by faith. Romans 3:28 says, "Therefore we conclude that a man is justified by faith without the deeds of the law." And in the next chapter it says, "For if Abraham were justified by works, he hath whereof to glory, but not before God. For what saith the Scripture? Abraham believed God, and it was counted unto him for righteousness." And so here we see that we're justified by faith. But then James 2 seems to contradict that by saying that we're justified by works. It says in a few select verses, "What doth it profit, my brethren, though a man say he hath faith and have not works? Can faith save him? Even so faith, if it hath not works, is dead, being alone. But wilt thou know, O vain man, that faith without works is dead? Was not Abraham our father justified by works when he had offered Isaac his son upon the altar? Ye see then how that by works a man is justified, and not by faith only." And so, yeah, this can easily seem to be contradictory, because Romans says that Abraham was not justified by works, but then James said that he was. And the book of James was really seen as a problem by Martin Luther. He famously called this an epistle of straw. He saw it as a disputed book or anti-legomena. And Martin Luther didn't actually think that James should be removed from the Bible or that it wasn't canon, but he did have issues with this book. And he believed that James was not a true apostle. And this is one of the many cases where I disagree with Martin Luther. Now, some people might be having a hard time believing that I disagree with him on anything because, according to a lot of people, if you're not a Catholic, then you follow Luther. That's just not true at all. I actually have a lot of problems with Luther, such as his anti-Semitism, his paedobaptism, his disputings of books like James, his belief in the Marian dogmas. I have a lot of problems with a lot of his theology, even though I also recognize that he accomplished some good as well. And I think that part of Martin Luther's problem with the book of James was the fact that he had famously protested the Catholic Church and he had opposed their works-based salvation. But then I think that his bad experience with Catholicism made him unable to see what James 2 was really talking about, because he saw James as teaching a works-based salvation, but that's really not what it was about. It was about your works validating or proving your faith, and this isn't a contradiction to passages like Ephesians 2 or Romans 4. These ideas actually complement each other. And you know, James 2 is used to teach several different things. For one, it's often used as a proof text for earning your salvation, which is how Rome often uses this passage. In other words, James 2 shows that you have to do good works to be saved. Other people will use this passage to teach lordship salvation, which I'm not entirely opposed to this concept, but I also don't agree with it. And the people on the lordship salvation side would use James 2 to say that you have to do good works to prove that you're saved, and if you don't, then it's proof that you never were saved. But as I read this passage and as I interpret it in context, I believe that this is not actually talking about salvation at all, at least not in the terms of being saved or becoming a Christian type of salvation. See, as we look at what faith in James 2 is referring to, this is not about saving faith, but about everyday faith, because we should recognize that faith is often used in different contexts, and it's not always in the salvation context. And as we look at the word save here, it's not referring to your salvation or your justification, because again, this word has meanings outside of the theological or justification context. For example, you could talk about saving money. You could say that a goalie in hockey gets a save. You could say that a doctor saves somebody's life. And so obviously the word save can mean different things. And we can't assume that every time the Bible says save, it means it the way that Romans 10:13 does, for whosoever shall call upon the name of the Lord shall be saved. And another reason why I think that James 2 isn't talking about salvation is because Abraham is used as an example. But Abraham already was saved, so we shouldn't interpret this as meaning justification. And so while we reconcile Romans 4 and James 2, we should remember that the Bible uses the word justify in different senses. And as I said in a previous point, sometimes people complain that we interpret words in different ways, but that's just the reality of language. Sometimes words can mean different things, and the way that you know the meaning of the word is by looking at the context. And so the context of Romans 4 is that Abraham was justified by faith, not by works. This is an obvious reference to his salvation or justification. But then in James 2, Abraham was justified by his works, not just faith, meaning that his works validated his faith, or they confirmed his faith, not that he earned his own salvation through his works, because it's not talking about salvation. And this is not just sneaky apologetics, that's just simply what the context shows. And so these passages, Romans 4 and James 2, they aren't a contradiction because they're talking about two different things. So when we come across the question, are we justified by faith or by works, you could honestly answer yes to both of those questions whenever you understand that there can be different contexts behind those words. So yes, Abraham was justified by faith alone because that's how he was saved. But no, Abraham was not justified by faith alone because his works validated his faith. And if you want more teaching on James chapter 2 and this passage that says that faith without works is dead, I'm going to put a link to my podcast episode where I cover that passage, and hopefully that'll be a help to you. But now let's come to this final alleged contradiction, and it's about an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. So we see the command here in Leviticus 24. It says, "And if a man cause a blemish in his neighbor, as he hath done, so shall it be done to him. Breach for breach, eye for eye, tooth for tooth. As he hath caused a blemish in a man, so shall it be done to him again." And so the teaching of eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth is from the Bible. But then we come to Matthew chapter 5, where Jesus is speaking and he's giving the Sermon on the Mount. And here's what he said. "Ye have heard that it hath been said, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. But I say unto you, that ye resist not evil, but whosoever shall smite thee on thy right cheek, turn to him the other also." And to many people, it would seem clear that Jesus is disagreeing with the Old Testament law, making it a contradiction. But really the key difference here is that Leviticus was referring to the government punishing individuals. Jesus was referring to individuals seeking revenge against each other. You see, Leviticus was about a legal standard and a civil law, but then Jesus was speaking to individuals, telling them how they should live and interact with other people. For example, if a person goes out and they rob a store at gunpoint, the state can put them in prison for that, but the owner of the store can't just lock them up in a shed. See, there's a difference between how the government is allowed to punish a person versus how an individual citizen can punish a person. You see, imprisoning the criminal is acceptable when done by the state, but if it's just an individual seeking revenge against another person, that's not okay. And so whenever Jesus is preaching the Sermon on the Mount, he is speaking to people who had taken this law about legal consequences, eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth, and these people had made it about personal revenge. And so enforcing an eye for an eye is the state's job, but forgiving our enemies is our job as individuals. And a few verses later, after Jesus condemns the abuse of this system, he says these words in verses 43 and 44. "Ye have heard that it hath been said, Thou shalt love thy neighbor and hate thine enemy. But I say unto you, love your enemies. Bless them that curse you, do good to them that hate you, and pray for them which despitefully use you and persecute you. And I think that here we should say that Jesus wasn't teaching to never resist evil. He wasn't saying that there is never a case where you can defend yourself, but rather he's establishing mercy as the general rule. This should be the norm if you are a believer in Jesus. In other words, don't be seeking to get even. Don't try to get ahead. Don't seek revenge. Rather, simply share the love and mercy of God with other people. Jesus says don't be retaliating whenever somebody harms you. Don't go out enforcing eye for an eye and tooth for a tooth. Rather, show mercy like God shows mercy. Forgive and love others the same way that Jesus does. And this isn't a contradiction to what the Old Testament says. It's really just Jesus giving a condemnation of how this system was abused. In other words, don't be taking matters into your own hands like people were commonly doing. And so I believe that the Bible has no contradictions or errors. And even though there are many people who have given many different lists of these alleged contradictions in the Bible, I think that every single case has a good explanation, where it's not just mental gymnastics or sneaky apologetics, but actual logical explanations. And this isn't just something that we as Christians assume or blindly believe. No, it's proven when we honestly look at the context of each verse. The Bible is free of contradictions, not because we as Christians feel pressure to believe that this is true, but because the context of every alleged contradiction shows the Bible to be consistent. Now, as I said in the beginning of this episode, there are many other supposed contradictions in the Bible that I just didn't have time to talk about in this episode. And so if you have a contradiction that you would like for me to address, then leave it in the comments below, and I might be doing a part 2 of this video. Well, if this video was a help, make sure to click the like button so that YouTube pushes it to more people. Make sure to subscribe so that you don't miss out on future episodes. And thanks for watching.